The gavel struck with a thunderous echo, its sound slicing through the courtroom like a blade. Emily, the guarded survivor, sat rigid, her hands clenched on the wooden table, eyes flickering between fear and defiance. Across the room, Richard, the velvet blade, leaned back, lips curling in a faint smile, as though savoring control. Daniel, the warm comforter, placed a steadying hand on Emily's shoulder, murmuring, "Breathe, you're not alone." But Sophie, the reluctant fire starter, broke the silence with a whisper, sharp and trembling. "They already know the truth." The judge's gaze swept over them all, heavy with judgment that none could escape. In that instant, every secret felt on the verge of unraveling, every lie pressed to its breaking point. Shadows lengthened in the chamber, and the weight of the unspoken past filled the air. No one dared move, for the trial had just begun, and already the past threatened to burn them alive. The courtroom stilled after the gavel's strike, yet the silence felt louder than any voice. Emily swallowed hard, her eyes locking on the folder of evidence stacked before her. "It isn't the truth," she whispered to herself, though her lips barely moved. Daniel leaned in, speaking low enough for no one else to hear, "You're stronger than this moment." But across the aisle, Richard's gaze never faltered, his calm composure like a predator watching prey. Sophie tapped her pencil against the page, capturing faces with sharp strokes as if trying to trap the truth in graphite lines. Above them all, the judge cleared his throat, heavy and slow, commanding the room's breath to return. It was the beginning of something no one would walk away from unscathed, and every shadow seemed to lean closer to listen. The prosecutor rose, shuffling papers that whispered like secrets untold. Emily's heartbeat quickened, her gaze fixed on the words she dreaded to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor began, voice firm, "what you will hear today is not just about guilt or innocence. It is about truth buried for years." Daniel steadied his breath beside her while Sophie's restless energy surged in impatient movements. Across the room, Richard crossed his legs, expression unreadable, his control unbroken. A shuttle deeper as the trial's first words cut through, opening a door none wanted to step through but all were forced to enter. Emily's fingers traced the folder edge as though the texture itself might offer clarity. Her voice trembled when she finally said, "They don't know what really happened." Daniel turned to her, tone even but eyes sharp. "Then it's time they learn." Sophie smirked slightly, sketching faster, her whisper cutting through the air. "Secrets don't stay buried, not forever." Richard tilted his head, calm and silent, watching with an expression both curious and cruel. The atmosphere thickened with anticipation, and the walls seemed to draw closer around them, as if the courtroom itself demanded the truth. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing behind his glasses. "Order," he demanded, though no one had spoken. Emily flinched, shoulders tightening, while Daniel straightened as though bracing for impact. Sophie stopped sketching, her gaze snapping upward with sharp defiance. Richard's lips curved in the faintest smirk, a signal only Emily seemed to catch. In the silence that followed, the weight of decades pressed into the chamber, every moment thick with the promise of revelation. The trial had not yet begun in full, but already the shadows of the past were speaking louder than the people themselves. The courtroom lights seemed harsher as Emily lowered her gaze, the papers before her blurring into meaningless lines. Daniel leaned close, whispering steady encouragement, though even his calm tone carried strain. Richard's smirk remained, a subtle reminder that he thrived in silence. Sophie shifted restlessly, her pencil pressing harder as if carving truth into the page. The prosecutor's voice droned with confidence, but Emily heard only the echoes of memories clawing their way up from the past. A faint scent of perfume seemed to drift from nowhere, a ghostly reminder of Michael, the one whose absence shaped every corner of this trial. The judge scribbled notes, unshaken, as if rehearsed for centuries. Emily's throat tightened, for she knew the moment to speak would come, and the world she had built to survive would shatter once she opened her mouth. The prosecutor placed a photograph on the evidence table, its glossy surface catching the courtroom light. Emily stiffened, her breath stalling as her eyes met the captured image. "Do you recognize this?" the prosecutor asked, voice unyielding. Daniel whispered, "Steady." Richard's eyes glimmered like steel, enjoying her discomfort. Sophie leaned forward, her sketchbook momentarily forgotten. The photo was of Michael, smiling, frozen forever at 18, his presence conjured by ink and paper. The memory of his disappearance was raw, even after all the years, and it pressed into Emily's chest with unbearable weight. The judge leaned slightly, his gaze sharpening as though he too felt the ghost in the room. Emily whispered under her breath, "He should not be here," but the truth was already staring back. Emily closed her eyes for a brief moment, and the courtroom disappeared. She saw Michael in flashes, the sound of his humming echoing in her memory. "Why show this now?" she asked softly, her voice cracking. Daniel pressed his hand against hers, grounding her back in the moment. Richard shifted in his seat, his smile replaced by a calculating stare. Sophie muttered, "They can't bury him twice," her voice laced with both anger and grief. The prosecutor turned toward the jury, speaking with grave weight. "This image connects to the truth long hidden in silence." The air thickened, heavy with the gravity of what was being revealed. Emily trembled, torn between grief and the dread of what lay ahead, while the shadows in the courtroom seemed to move closer. The photograph remained on the table, glowing under the lights like a relic from another life. Emily's voice faltered, "I cannot," before catching in her throat. Daniel leaned closer, urging gently, "You must." Richard crossed his arms, his cold gaze sharpening like a blade. Sophie slammed her pencil against the page, whispering fiercely, "Say it." The prosecutor stepped back, letting silence do the work, his confidence resonating in stillness. The judge tapped his pen, a low rhythm that amplified the unease. Emily's hands shook, her fingers brushing the photo, her eyes wet with memory. Michael's absence thundered louder than any words, and the photograph became both proof and accusation, daring her to finally unseal the truth she had hidden. Emily finally lifted her gaze, her voice breaking the suffocating silence. "Yes," she admitted, "I know him." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, as though releasing held breath. Richard leaned forward, his smirk returning, victory glinting in his eyes. Sophie whispered, "At last," her expression both relief and fury. The prosecutor nodded slowly, voice calm but heavy. "Then the truth begins here." The judge marked his notes, his expression unreadable but keen. The air felt fractured, as though the courtroom itself split between past and present. Emily's confession echoed, not just in the room but in the hearts of all who carried the memory of Michael. What was once unspoken was now undeniable, and the trial had gained a ghost no one could silence. The silence stretched as the photograph lingered in the jury's sight, but the tension was pierced by the defense attorney rising at last. Emily's chest tightened as she heard the challenge begin. The prosecution's narrative is incomplete. Daniel placed a steadying hand near hers, grounding her, while Richard's smirk turned sharper, like a blade finally unsheathed. Sophie muttered under her breath, "Incomplete doesn't mean false," her pencil scratching angrily across the page. The judge lifted a brow, signaling for composure, his patience worn thin by the clash already forming. Emily's pulse echoed in her ears, and the weight of truth pressed harder than chains. She whispered inside herself, "What if the secrets go deeper than even I know?" The defense attorney lifted a sheet of paper, waving it slightly for the jury to see. "Evidence can vanish," he said firmly, "but absence does not prove guilt." Emily felt her heart twist, for the missing pages he spoke of were not lost to time, but hidden by trembling hands long ago. Richard leaned forward, expression darkening, his control momentarily slipping. Daniel exhaled through his nose, muttering, "This complicates everything." Sophie tapped her pencil like a drumbeat, her voice biting. "It always comes back." The prosecutor objected sharply, his voice slicing the air, but the judge's gavel restored balance, each strike reminding them that truth and lies must stand trial together. The judge allowed the papers to be examined, and whispers swept the jury box. Emily lowered her head, shame pressing heavier with every passing second. Richard's voice broke the quiet, steady and venomous, Not all truths deserve daylight. Daniel stiffened, his jaw tightening. But he said nothing. Loyalty etched in silence. Sophie's glare sharpened as she hissed, spoken like a man with too much to hide. Prosecutor leaned forward, pressing his point. What is hidden still matters. The judge's pen scratched against paper, the sound echoing like a countdown. Emily's breath stuttered, for she knew Richard's words were more than posturing. They were warnings directed at her heart. Emily's eyes lifted at last, courage flickering though her voice wavered. "Secrets do not vanish," she said softly, the words fragile yet unshakable. Richard's eyes narrowed, his smirk erased by fury contained beneath composure. Daniel turned toward her with silent pride, but fear laced his expression. Sophie leaned forward, whispering urgently, "Keep going." The prosecutor gestured toward the evidence, seizing her words as fuel. The witness confirms what shadows could not hide. The jury leaned in, faces etched with unease, and the air grew heavier, as if walls themselves pressed closer. Emily felt a tremor in her hand as she steadied the folder once more, knowing there was no return. The gavel struck once more, silencing all but the pounding of hearts. The judge's voice carried weight. "This trial is not for games of shadow. It is for truth." Emily exhaled, a sound almost breaking, while Daniel clasped his hands, whispering a prayer no one heard. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, regaining his calm mask, though his eyes still burned. Sophie scribbled fiercely, her pencil nearly breaking under pressure, muttering, "Truth bleeds through." The prosecutor read aloud from the missing page, his words sharp as knives. "What was erased returns today." Emily's vision blurred, not with tears but with the crushing certainty that the trial was no longer about survival, it was about exposure. The courtroom air thickened as the prosecutor lifted a sealed envelope, edges yellowed with age. Emily's pulse hammered, for she knew the letter before it was named. Richard's eyes flickered, his calm mask straining for the first time. Daniel leaned forward, whispering, "What is that?" But Emily did not answer. Sophie froze, her pencil stilled mid-line, sensing something monumental. The prosecutor announced, "This was recovered from the family estate, hidden for decades." Emily's chest constricted, memories colliding with the present, for the letter had been hers, untouched since Michael's disappearance. The judge ordered it opened, his voice grave. The sound of paper tearing echoed like thunder, carrying a secret long chained. The letter unfolded slowly, its ink faded but legible, and the words struck Emily like blows. Michael's handwriting spilled across the page, his confession raw and haunting. "I cannot stay," the prosecutor read aloud. "The truth will destroy us all." Emily gasped, whispering, "No, that's not what he meant." Daniel reached for her hand, but she pulled back, her body trembling. Richard's smirk returned, sly and cruel, as though vindicated by the words. Sophie whispered fiercely, "He was running from someone, not from you." The jury shifted uneasily, murmurs rising like waves. The judge silenced them with a gavel strike, his tone sharp, but the truth was out. The letter connected Michael's disappearance to the family itself. The prosecutor placed the letter on the evidence table, its presence unbearable in its simplicity. Emily shook her head, muttering, "He didn't leave us, someone made him." Richard crossed his legs, his stare sharp enough to cut glass. Daniel whispered with urgency, "Emily, if you know more, now is the time." Sophie slammed her sketchbook shut, eyes burning. "Stop pretending. Everyone knows the truth is right here." The judge leaned forward, asking firmly, "Do you contest this letter?" Emily's lips parted, her voice trapped between denial and release. She felt Michael's presence as though he stood in the room, urging her toward revelation. The weight of her silence crushed her, for every second made her complicit. Emily finally rose, her chair scraping against the marble floor like a scream. "Michael didn't abandon us," she said, voice breaking. Richard's hand twitched, his first crack in composure. Daniel's eyes widened, bracing for what was coming. Sophie whispered, "Say it," her voice raw with both fear and hunger for truth. Emily pointed directly at Richard, trembling but unshaken. He was silenced. And you were the one who held the blade. Gasps erupted across the courtroom, the jury recoiling at the accusation. The prosecutor froze, stunned at the bold revelation. Richard's smirk shattered, replaced by fury he could no longer hide. The judge's gavel thundered, but the words had already set the chamber on fire. Chaos thundered through the chamber, but Emily's words echoed louder than any noise. Richard rose slowly, his face pale but his voice venomous. You think you know the truth, but you only know fragments. Daniel stepped between them instinctively, shielding Emily though his hands shook. Sophie shouted, "Fragments are enough to tear you down." The prosecutor demanded order, but the tide had already turned. Emily's chest heaved as she whispered to herself, "It's out now. He can't bury it again." Richard's eyes locked on hers with hatred, and in that gaze the decades of manipulation were laid bare. The judge's repeated strikes of the gavel could not silence the haunting revelation. The family secret had exploded into the open. The courtroom roared with tension as the judge demanded silence, his voice cracking through the chaos. Emily stood trembling, her words already etched into every ear. Richard's face had hardened into fury, though his eyes revealed a sliver of fear. Daniel remained at her side, his steady hand grounding her, whispering, "You've gone too far to stop now." Sophie glared at Richard, her voice rising above the silence. "Your lies are finished." The prosecutor pointed at the letter, shouting, "This is the foundation of everything." Emily's chest heaved as she felt Michael's memory pressing against her, urging her to finish what she began. The weight of the past and present fused into one unbearable truth, demanding to be spoken fully. Emily's voice cut the silence, fragile but resolute. "Michael knew too much. He tried to tell me." Richard slammed his hand against the table, shouting, "Lies!" Daniel stepped forward, placing himself between them, his voice calm yet sharp. "You can't silence her anymore." Sophie stood, sketchbook clutched tightly, yelling, "You silenced him once, but you want to do it again." The prosecutor raised his hand, calling the jury's attention. "Listen carefully, for this is the turning point." The judge's eyes narrowed, gavel ready to strike again. Emily's knees weakened, but her courage grew, for she was no longer speaking just for herself. She spoke for Michael, whose ghost lingered in every corner of the chamber. The jury gasped as the prosecutor revealed another page hidden within the envelope, one Emily had never seen. The ink was darker, fresher, and the words more damning. "He named you Richard," the prosecutor declared. Richard froze, his lips parting but no words emerging. Emily staggered back, whispering, "It wasn't just suspicion. He knew." Daniel clenched his fists, whispering firmly, "The mask is gone." Sophie's face blazed with fury as she hissed, "Michael trusted the wrong man." The judge's gavel struck to hold order, but the chamber buzzed with revelation. Emily's body shook with both relief and terror, for the truth had finally been named aloud. Richard finally erupted, his voice venomous. "That letter was planted. I never touched him." Emily stepped forward, her fear transformed into rage, shouting, "You held the blade, Richard. Michael's blood is on your hands." Daniel restrained her with a gentle hand, whispering, "Don't let him break you now." Sophie's eyes burned as she pointed at Richard, yelling, "The truth doesn't need planting. It grows through cracks you can't hide." The prosecutor spoke with grim finality, "Every lie builds your cage tighter." The judge's voice cut through, "The jury will decide." The chamber quivered with the force of accusation and denial, as the climax crested like a storm. The gavel thundered, finality ringing across the courtroom. Emily collapsed into her chair, breath ragged, her words echoing still. Richard sank down, his mask shattered, eyes hollow though defiance lingered. Daniel sat beside Emily, whispering softly, "You carried it through." Sophie leaned forward, her voice shaking, "Michael is heard now." The prosecutor folded the damning letter with care, presenting it to the judge. "This evidence cannot be ignored." The judge's face was grave as he declared, "The jury will deliberate." Silence reclaimed the room, heavy and suffocating, for all knew that nothing would return to the way it was. Emily stared at the table, her hands trembling, her past finally forced into daylight. The courtroom sat in heavy silence as the jury filed out, their footsteps echoing like the toll of bells. Emily gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles pale, whispering to herself, "It's no longer mine to carry." Daniel leaned close, voice steady though quiet. "Whatever they decide, you spoke." Richard adjusted his tie with trembling hands, fury buried under hollow pride. Sophie's eyes never left him, her sketchbook now closed, clenched like a weapon of truth. The prosecutor stacked his papers, face solemn, as though he already bore the verdict's weight. The judge leaned back, his gavel resting quietly, a symbol of judgment yet to come. The past had been ripped open, and all they could do was wait for the wound to close or bleed. Minutes stretched like hours, and Emily felt her heart pounding louder than the clock on the wall. Daniel whispered, "You're stronger than the silence." Richard muttered under his breath, "This isn't over." His eyes locked on Emily with venom. Sophie snapped back. "It ended the moment he wrote your name." The prosecutor walked slowly, his polished shoes scraping against marble, as if marking time. Emily pressed her palm flat against the folder, her hand trembling as though Michael's voice still whispered through the paper. The judge's gaze swept across them all, silent but powerful, like a storm waiting for release. The air carried the chill of a verdict that would alter every life within these walls. At last the doors opened, and the jury returned, their faces pale and unreadable. Emily's chest tightened as her gaze locked on them, searching for any sign of mercy. Daniel squeezed her arm lightly, grounding her. Richard straightened, composure creeping back like armor, though sweat glistened on his brow. Sophie leaned forward, whispering, "This is it." The prosecutor folded his arms, eyes fixed firmly on the foreman. The judge asked, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman nodded, his voice carrying through the chamber, "We have." Emily's pulse froze in her veins, for the words about to be spoken would decide not only Richard's fate, but hers as well. The foreman's words rang clear, "Guilty." Gasps rippled through the courtroom like wind through broken glass. Emily covered her mouth, tears welling as years of silence cracked open. Daniel exhaled heavily, his hand steadying her shoulder. Richard's face drained of color, his fury collapsing into disbelief, whispering, "No, this cannot be." Sophie slammed her sketchbook shut, eyes blazing with vindication. "Michael speaks through this verdict." The prosecutor bowed his head, a grim nod to justice. The judge raised his gavel, declaring, "The court finds Richard guilty." The chamber quaked with finality, the echoes carrying Michael's presence like a haunting hymn that would never fade. The gavel struck, sealing Richard's fate. Emily exhaled, a trembling release she had carried for years. Daniel leaned closer, whispering softly, "You are free now, even if scars remain." Sophie wiped her eyes roughly, her voice steady. "Michael's silence is broken." Richard slumped in his chair, shackled by the weight of truth more than any chain. The prosecutor gathered the evidence, his eyes briefly meeting Emily's with respect. The judge's voice declared, "Justice has been delivered," though the words rang heavy, neither triumph nor relief. Emily's gaze dropped to her hands, trembling still, for she knew the verdict was not an ending. It was the beginning of living with the truth unburied at last. The courtroom emptied slowly, benches creaking as footsteps faded into the marble halls. Emily remained seated, unable to rise, her eyes fixed on the table where Michael's letter still lay. Daniel hovered nearby, his voice gentle, "You don't have to carry it alone anymore." Richard was escorted out in shackles, his face a hollow shell, fury drained into silence. Sophie clutched her sketchbook to her chest, whispering, "The story is written now." The prosecutor gathered his files with deliberate care, giving Emily a quiet nod before leaving. The judge slipped away, robes trailing like shadows. Emily's hands trembled as she touched the edge of the letter once more, knowing Michael's presence would never leave this room. Outside, gray clouds rolled above the courthouse, the day heavy with rain threatening to fall. Emily stepped out at last, her face pale yet determined, clutching the folder against her chest. Daniel walked beside her, steady as always, his silence a comfort. Sophie lingered just behind, her voice low. The world will remember him now. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashing like lightning, but Emily ignored them, her eyes fixed forward. Richard was pulled into a waiting vehicle, chains rattling, his glare locked on her as if trying to pierce her resolve. Emily drew a breath against the chill air, knowing the storm was not over, but something had shifted. The truth was no longer buried. Emily paused at the courthouse gates, the weight of memory pressing against her ribs. She whispered softly, "Michael, it's done," though no one else could hear. Daniel glanced at her, recognizing the private moment, but said nothing. Sophie opened her sketchbook, flipping to the final page she had drawn. Michael's face, alive in graphite lines, staring back with haunting clarity. Richard's vehicle vanished into the rain, swallowed by distance. The prosecutor passed by quietly, offering no words, his solemn expression acknowledgement enough. Emily felt a strange calm, not victory, but the release of something long locked away. Yet in that release, grief returned sharper than ever, cutting her from within. Rain began to fall, cold drops tapping against stone as Emily finally let the tears come. Daniel held an umbrella over her, though she hardly noticed, her gaze lost in memory. Sophie pressed the drawing into her hands, whispering, "He belongs with you." Emily stared at the portrait, her tears smudging the lines until Michael's face blurred into the storm. Richard's absence was louder than his presence, his shadow lingering even as chains carried him away. The courthouse loomed behind them, its walls now a monument to truth and blood. Emily whispered, "Justice has its price," her voice breaking against the rain. Daniel squeezed her shoulder, silent but present, anchoring her in the downpour. As the rain poured harder, Emily lifted her face to the sky, the storm washing her clean but leaving scars uncovered. Daniel guided her gently toward the waiting car, his voice soft, "It's time to go home." Sophie followed, silent now, her sketchbook pressed to her chest. Yet Emily paused once more, whispering to the storm, "Michael, they finally heard you." For a fleeting moment, she swore she felt his presence beside her, a warmth in the chill rain, a reminder of what was lost and what was reclaimed. Behind her, the courthouse stood still, its windows dark, its halls echoing with truths that could never be forgotten. The story had ended, but its echo would haunt forever.